In this video, I want to investigate the nature of our thoughts. I'm going to use the instrument of an argument, which I call the awareness argument, because it's based on our awareness of our own thoughts. Now, this argument will look familiar to some of you because I gave an initial presentation of this argument in another video. And if you saw that video, you know that I offered a $100 prize for the most liked objection. And I'm going to be talking about that objection in this video. So my purpose in this video is to provide a more detailed exposition of the argument. I want to begin by thanking the many of you who provided those comments and criticisms and objections to my initial presentation. I read through all of them and I appreciated them very much because they helped me to see some places that really need to be clarified, some points of disconnect. And so thank you for that. In fact, there were a couple of response videos, people who made videos responding to my video, and I was grateful for those as well because in a similar way, they helped me to see what people are, how they're interpreting the argument. And so what I want to do is clarify the argument so that we can see what's going on. Okay, I'm going to just lay out the argument, and then I'm going to clarify some of the premises. And then we're going to have a look at the most common objection to the argument that I've received. So the argument has a couple premises and then a conclusion. The first premise, what I'm going to call the awareness premise, says that you are aware of your thoughts, at least some of them, and not your brain states. The identity premise, which is about identity, it says this: if you are aware of A and not B, then A is not B. Therefore, your thoughts are not your brain states. Okay, so you probably have some questions, maybe some objections. So let's have a closer look at the premises. Let's start with the awareness premise. So to help us think about this, imagine there's this guy, Bob, okay, and he's having a thought. Let's say Bob is thinking about a zebra. Now, in order for Bob to know that he's thinking about a zebra, he's got to have some kind of access to the thought. Let's just say that access, we'll call that awareness. So he's aware of that thought, and he's able to report it. He's able to say that he's thinking about a zebra and not about a giraffe. And how is he able to do that? Well, it's not by looking at his brain and seeing what his brain is doing. I mean, for thousands of years, people had no idea about the details of what brains do and how they're connected to thoughts. But even without having any awareness of what the brain is doing, Bob is able to be aware of what he's thinking. Okay, now hold on to your objections because we're going to look at some possible misunderstandings of the premise. Here's the premise again. You are aware of your thoughts and not your brain states. Okay, now look, this premise leads to lots of confusion. And to help clarify what this is really saying, I'm going to use an analogy of a coin. So imagine you've got a coin, and this coin has a head side and a tail side. Now imagine that the heads and the tails belong to the same coin. Then there's one thing here, one thing, one coin. But even though there's one coin, we can make a distinction between the heads side of the coin and the tail side. And notice that these sides are connected. If you spin the heads, the tails will spin. And if you spin the tails, the heads will spin. So they're causally connected. They're deeply integrated, but they're not the same. In fact, we can see that they're not the same by the awareness argument. You can be aware of the heads without being aware of the tails. But if the heads is the tails, they're one of the same side, then by being aware of the heads, you would thereby be aware of the tails. And since that's not the case, you can infer that the heads is not the tails, that they're manifestly distinct, okay? Now, in the same way, you can be aware of your thoughts. So imagine people being aware of what they're thinking for many thousands of years without having any inside knowledge of the structure of their brain, the physical stuff that's correlated with the mental reality that they're directly, immediately aware of in their conscious experience. So I would just want to clarify that this premise is not saying that thoughts are completely separate from brain states, or even that thoughts belong to a fundamentally different kind of reality from the reality that brain states belong to. This is an important point. I actually think that both thoughts and brain states belong to the same reality. You are one single reality, just like this coin is one reality. It's got two different sides. You are one reality, and you have thoughts and you have brain states. So this first premise is just saying that you can be aware of your thoughts, like that 2 + 2 = 4, or that this is a strange argument or whatever, without thereby having to first be aware of what your brain is doing, what the axons are doing, what the particles are doing, etc. So that's the idea. Okay, now look again at the identity premise. If you are aware of A, like heads, and not B, like tails, then A is not B. Now this premise actually flows from a more general principle that goes back to Leibniz, which says that if A is B, then whatever is true of A is true of B. And the is here is the is of identity. They're one and the same thing. So for example, if the heads of the coin just is the heads of that same coin, then whatever is true of that heads is true of that heads. This is a principle of identity. And it's interesting because this is a principle of identity that is widely accepted. I actually don't know any philosopher who rejects this principle. Maybe there are philosophers who do. I've met philosophers who reject all sorts of things, including their own existence, but I've never encountered anyone who rejects this principle. It's considered to be a just self-evident principle. I would actually treat this as a definition of what I mean by identity. So part of what I mean by identity is that whatever is true of A is true of whatever A is identical to. Okay, that's just what I mean. And so on this understanding of identity, if you are aware of something, it's true of, let's say, your thought that you're aware of it, but it's not true of, let's say, your brain state that you're aware of that, then they can't be the same thing, because if they were, then whatever's true of the one is true of the other, just by this law of identity. Okay, so here again is the argument. We have the awareness premise, the identity premise, and therefore your thoughts are not your brain states. And you can use this argument form in many different contexts. For example, we can show that the heads of a coin is not the same as the tails of the coin, just because you can be aware of the heads without thereby being aware of the tails. You can be aware of your thought that zebras exist without thereby being aware of the brain states that give rise to that thought, or that are constituents of that thought, or however they're related. You don't have to be aware of the brain states to be aware of the thought, and that's enough to verify the non-identity. As I mentioned, many of you provided me with objections to the awareness argument, and I'm very grateful for that, because objections are like tests of the soundness of an argument. My goal is not to defend an argument just because it's my argument. I really want to know whether the argument is actually sound. So I read through all the objections, and I noticed a pattern. I noticed that all the objections seemed to flow out of two roots. One was there were questions about the meaning of terms. And so these are questions that inspire me to clarify the argument, which is the purpose of this video. And then there were objections to the conclusion of the argument, not so much to the premises, but more to the consequent of those premises. And here I got the sense that many people associated the conclusion with something kind of negative and spooky. And in fact, like one of the reply videos talked about me arguing for the existence of woo, like this sort of ectoplasmic, immaterial stuff that nobody has any observation of. And so I think that that's a very important type of objection. It actually helped me to see a place where the argument can be misunderstood. And in fact, I actually want to just clarify right now that the conclusion of the argument is not about something that we don't see, but it's actually about something that we witness immediately and directly within our own consciousness, namely our own thoughts. The purpose of the argument is not to show that your thoughts have some spooky nature beyond everything we know. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's to highlight that your thoughts have a nature that you do know immediately just by having those thoughts and just by focusing on what those thoughts are like. When you have the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, you can inspect that thought and you can witness directly that it has the property of being about some numbers, being about 2 + 2 and not about 3 or 4 or zebras. And how can you see this? Well, it's because you're aware of the thought. You're aware of its aspects. So it's not positing some extra aspects beyond what you're aware of. It's actually just drawing attention to what you are aware of. And I think this understanding of the conclusion can help to eliminate some of these negative associations of the conclusion with ectoplasma or with woo or whatever spooky unknown things. I'm going to say more about that as I clarify the argument in light of the objection that I'm going to look at next. So, who won the prize for the most liked objection? This was also the most common objection. Caesar Bernstein, congratulations. You represented many people very well when you presented the following objection. Here is the objection. It's actually a parity argument. Premise 1, Bob is aware of water, but Bob is not aware of H2O. Therefore, contrary to what we know scientifically, water isn't H2O. And the point of this argument is to draw out a problem with this type of reasoning, right? It's tempting to think that you can be aware of water without being aware of H2O in the same way that you can be aware of your thoughts without being aware of your brain states, but it's a mistake to infer that therefore water isn't H2O. Science, in fact, reveals that water is H2O, and in the same way, science reveals that your thoughts are physical brain states. And it would be anti-science or ignorant of science to think that your thoughts are sort of beyond the physical brain structure that encodes those thoughts. So let's have a closer look at this argument. Here's a picture of some water that'll help us to think about the argument. And let's look more precisely at this first premise. So this premise says that Bob is aware of water. What does it mean to say that Bob is aware of water? I mean, if you think about it, people have been drinking water for thousands of years, and they can refer to this thing that they call water. But what is this thing that they're referring to? On one level, we could associate the word water with the watery properties that people experience directly. For example, its liquid state, or its drinkability, or its clearness. But on another level, scientists have revealed to us a molecular structure, the stuff inside, that gives rise to these watery properties. So what does water refer to? Does it refer to these watery properties, or does it refer to the molecular structure that gives rise to the watery properties? Well, if we take the scientific view that water refers actually to the structural properties, then when we say that Bob is aware of water, what we're actually saying is that he's indirectly aware of the structural properties that give rise to what people are directly aware of, namely the watery properties that they associate with the molecular structure. But keep in mind that those same watery properties could be associated with a different molecular structure. Sometimes philosophers use XYZ to refer to this alternative molecular structure that people could have found out that the watery properties are associated with. But it just happens to be that these watery properties are associated with H2O. And that was a discovery of science, right? So we don't want to say that Bob is directly aware of the H2O. Rather, he's indirectly aware of H2O by being directly aware of the watery properties that he experiences. So then, for this argument to be valid, we need to use the same terms here. So we don't want to equivocate, right? So we place indirect awareness into premise 2, and now we can see what's wrong with this argument, because premise 2 directly contradicts premise 1. Bob is indirectly aware of H2O. Bob isn't indirectly aware of H2O. Those contradict each other, so this argument is indeed problematic. So now we want to look at the awareness argument having to do with thoughts and see if it falls prey to the exact same analysis. So here we have Bob, and Bob is aware of his thought. So by the parallel argument, we can make a distinction between this zebra thought that he's directly aware of, this is like the watery properties, and the molecular structure. You might think the stuff inside the thought that like gives rise to the thought, or that causes the thought, that's correlated with the thought. This is like the real stuff. This is what science reveals, okay? And so what we want to say here is that Bob is indirectly aware of his axon firing, whatever that brain state is. And then in the same way that we saw with the parallel argument, this premise contradicts this second premise, which is that he isn't indirectly aware of his brain state. No, he is, by the first premise. And so this argument falls apart. So there you go. This argument does fall apart, and the parallel argument reveals a problem. Okay, but wait a second. Think about this with me. What does it mean to say that Bob is indirectly aware of an axon firing? Well, for him to be indirectly aware of something, he has to be directly aware of something else, because that's just what it means to be indirectly aware. If Bob is indirectly aware of something inside of his brain, then that's only possible because he's directly aware of something else. And what else could that be? What could he be directly aware of in virtue of which we can say he's indirectly aware of his brain? Well, obviously, the only possible answer here is it's the thought that's correlated with the brain state. He's directly aware of, let's say, a zebra thought. He can inspect it and distinguish it from a giraffe thought or thoughts about numbers. He's directly aware of that. And it's by virtue of that direct awareness that he's indirectly aware of the stuff in his brain. So, although there's this interpretation of this argument that does show that it's a parallel argument to the water argument, and this parallel interpretation is a bad argument, and for the same reason, there's another interpretation of this argument that takes into account Bob's direct awareness. And if we really want to get to the truth about an argument, we want to find the best interpretation of the argument. We want to see if there is an interpretation that makes that argument most plausible. And if the argument falls apart on its best interpretation, then we've got the greatest insight into the problem with that argument. So what I'm proposing to you here is that the best interpretation of this argument understands this first premise not in terms of indirect awareness, but rather in terms of direct awareness. Bob is directly aware of his first-person thought, and it's in virtue of this direct awareness that you could say that he's indirectly aware of a brain state, okay? So now, for the argument to be valid, we need to use the same term here, direct awareness. So look at premise 2 now. Bob isn't directly aware of his brain state. So now we have a clear understanding of the argument. We can understand the argument in terms of direct awareness. What you are directly aware of are your thoughts. That's why you can report them. That's why you can describe them immediately without first having to check something else, namely the physical structures of your brain. But you're not thereby directly aware of the physical structures of your brain. And why think that? Well, because you're unable to report the physical properties of your brain. And you would be able to do that if you had direct awareness of those physical properties. Now, let me just be clear here about another source of confusion. When I say that Bob's thought isn't his brain state, this is like me saying that heads is not tails. Again, I'm not saying that his thought and his brain state aren't intimately connected or that they don't belong to the same basic reality. You, for example. In fact, I think they do belong to the same reality. They both belong to you. You have brain states and you have thoughts. But the point is that the thought is not reducible to the physical brain states. Now, I realize that there are a lot of concepts in play here, and so you may have further objections and questions, and that's great. Feel free to share those in the comments below. But what I'd like to do is offer some final observations about the argument. First, this argument is based on reason and experience. Reason reveals the law of identity, that if A is B, then whatever is true of A is true of B. And experience reveals the reality of your own thoughts. That's how you can distinguish one thought from another. And this experience is universal. Anybody who's watching this video has access to reason and experience relevant to the premises in the argument. You don't have to trust some authority. And that's a reason that I like this argument, because it puts the power in your hands to investigate the argument from your own perspective using reason and common experience. Second, the argument takes seriously the reality of your own mind. In Western culture, there's such an emphasis on the reality of things beyond your mind, physical things outside of your own conscious experience. And sometimes people will say things like, well, that's just in your head, as if the things in your head aren't actually real. It's interesting to me that in the positive psychology literature, there are things that you can do within your own thinking to actually affect your health because your thinking is real. If you have a gratitude journal, for example, and you record the 5 things that went well that day, that actually affects the health of your brain. It affects the health of your brain because your thoughts have an actual reality that's connected to the reality of the external physical structures. It's also interesting to me and ironic that the physical stuff that Western culture emphasizes is invisible to us. It's the stuff that we posit beyond our experience of our own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Our own conscious experience is what we have direct and immediate access to. People in Western culture have often flipped this, saying that it's the physical brain that's the most real, the most obvious thing that we all know about, and that your conscious thoughts, like that's somehow a spooky ectoplasmic woo posit that you have to to imagine to exist without any evidence. Well, it's quite the opposite. The most clear thing, and Sam Harris makes this point. I mean, he argues for the same conclusion, that what's most clear is the reality of your own mind, your own consciousness. That's what you have immediate direct access to. And finally, it provides a platform for further inquiry. I mentioned Sam Harris because he comes from a more naturalistic perspective, and whether you're a naturalist or a theist, you can celebrate the result of this argument, if you think it's a sound argument, namely that your thoughts are real, and they have the nature that they seem to have when you focus on your thoughts. They're not spooky things that are other than what they seem to be. When you think that 2 + 2 = 4, the nature of that thought is just what it seems to be when you have that thought. So thank you for watching this video. I hope that it serves you. And thank you for joining me in this effort to develop a sound worldview in a way that's depolarizing, in a way where truth seekers from all stripes can learn from each other, and we can all deepen our own understanding of the world together. So I hope this serves you in that effort, and I wish you the best. Thank you.